Mr. Holston.
Thank you. It's 1981. Ronald Reagan is President of the United States. The AIDS crisis is decimating the LGBTQ community in the United States. The government in the United States is turning a blind eye to that. Civil wars are going on in Guatemala and El Salvador. The secret police of those countries are being trained at the School of Americas in Columbus, Georgia. Refugees are arriving here, or have just been arriving here in the United States from the end of the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia, and are seeking refuge here under the brand new Refugee Act of 1980. I've learned all these things, however, and I am at SMU Law School at the time, and nothing about my education at SMU Law School is preparing me for any of that, or to inspire me to actually use my law license to do anything about any of those things. So I get out of law school in 1981 and I hang up a shingle. I started practicing law. I signed up for court-appointed criminal cases and started trying cases. I was in the courthouse every day as a trial lawyer. I was working my way through school, parking cars at night, working at a law office during the day. And then I got sworn in by Ed Kincaid, who's now a federal judge here. And I was really fortunate to become a lawyer in that era because I had the opportunity to try a lot of cases. It's more difficult now for young lawyers to get that experience. But in that era, I was able to go to the courthouse right away and start trying cases. And then in the course of all of that, I had a single, which seemed to me at the time, random encounter that changed the trajectory of my whole life, actually led me to be here speaking to you this morning. I was representing a young man from El Salvador in a burglary case. And I got a call from Brad Ginter, who was a Mennonite missionary. He called me and said, "Bill, you are representing," gave me this guy's name. And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Have you visited him in jail yet?" This was a court-appointed case. My client was in jail. I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, tell me, what are you going to do on this case?" And I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm a Mennonite missionary. I'm sure you're familiar with the Salvadoran Civil War." And I went, "Not really." And he said, "Well, there's civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people are coming here to the United States to seek refuge." And then I did something, I said something, I gave it no thought at all, and it changed my life. I said, "Well, if you ever need a hand, call me." I figure after you've had similar experiences in your life. Well, he did. He started calling me. And I started out by doing guardianships for unaccompanied minors. These were children who were up here because their parents were dead or missing because of the wars, and they were living with a brother or sister or aunt or uncle or friend, and they needed a guardianship to get enrolled in school. And I started doing that. Then I took an asylum law training through Catholic Charities, and I took my first asylum case. A woman named Marta from Guatemala. Her husband was a labor leader in a truckers union. They were taking their kids to school one morning, and an unmarked car pulled up, grabbed him, pulled him into the car, took off, and then she was called a few days later to come identify his body in the morgue. As she investigated what had happened to him, she realized he had been assassinated by a death squad, which was not uncommon at that time for people who were considered to be opponents of the government to be killed by these death squads. Then she and her children started getting death threats, and she came here to the United States seeking refuge. She showed up at the office of Proyecto Adelante, which was a small grassroots legal aid clinic in Oak Cliff. And they sent the case to me. I helped her get asylum, and I was hooked because I thought this is the most interesting thing I've ever done as a lawyer. Give me another one of those cases. And I did that for 25 years. I wound up representing people from 21 different countries. And frankly, I could spend the entire time this morning just telling you stories about the people I had the great privilege to represent who inspired me so much with their bravery and their resilience and their courage, standing up for democracy many times, or sometimes people who were persecuted because of their sexual orientation or their religion, the fact that they were a minority religious group. These were people who had experienced really terrible things, torture, really just tragedy. However, the thing that really came to inspire me was just how inspiring the people were, how resilient they were, and how courageous they were, and it really changed my life. And I became more and more passionate about that work. Frankly, a process that has continued through today. I'm as energized by the people that I've had the great privilege to represent now as I was 25 years ago. So I started. So that's the first season of my career, and how I really almost accidentally, or just by saying yes, wound up getting into this work. And I did that for 25 years, and I balanced that with a trial practice. I was representing businesses, banks, small equipment leasing companies, small businesses, things like that. But I had one of those asylum cases going all the time. And then in 2011, I've been practicing law for 32 years at that point. I'd taken every deposition I ever cared to take, made all the arguments in court I ever really wanted to for business matters. And the executive director of the Human Rights Initiative left. Well, Human Rights Initiative was an organization that I'd taken cases from the moment they opened their doors in the year 2000. And this is really important because it was founded by two women, two very strong women. One, Betsy Healy, who was a trial attorney with a medical malpractice defense firm in Dallas, and Serena Conley, who was a social worker. And the two of them had this vision for providing very high quality professional legal services for people who really needed them. This were refugees to our country, asylum seekers, with integrated social services, and to do all that through a network of volunteers. That was their vision, and they started that, and I was one of their first volunteer lawyers taking those cases, and I really loved the work. And so in 2012, when the ED left, I still remember this. I was in the car with my wife, and she said, "You want to apply for that job, don't you?" And I went, "Yeah, I do." And so I did, and they were unable to find any qualified candidates, so they hired me. And it's been great. I've led this organization for the last 11 years and through 3 presidential administrations. I like saying to people, I've been doing this work since the War of 1812, and it's always been hard, and I've been critical of every single administration through that entire period of time, including now. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about what it was like to practice this in this area for representing asylum seekers in particular, and also immigrant children, as well as immigrant women who are escaping domestic violence. Those are our programs that we do. So what was it like to do that work in the last 3 administrations? Well, I'll start with the Obama administration. Well, we look back on the Obama administration sort of longingly. It was such a sea change in the world, the fact that we had in this country had elected a black president. It was inspiring. It was inspiring to the rest of the world. However, on immigration, it was a real mixed bag in the Obama administration. And there were things that occurred in that administration that, in my opinion, and many of us that worked in this area, were quite unjust. First of all, we were detaining families. I'll let that sink in a minute. Detaining families in detention centers, which is just a fancy legal word for prison. And the Obama administration was sued over the conditions in these detention centers. In addition, of course, the administration failed to drive home immigration reform. The Senate had a bipartisan Immigration Reform Act, which died in the House. Now, the president did issue DACA, and so this was for the benefit. This benefited, of course, the Dreamers, kids that came here as young children. Now, teachers, doctors, lawyers, judges, the doctors, our state of Texas sued the federal government in order to invalidate DACA. This was just argued in a federal district court the last couple weeks. People I know, you know, love, are sitting waiting to see if a federal judge is going to rule that DACA goes away. Now, that's not on Obama. President Obama passed DACA, and that was a very good thing. Perhaps, in my view, the thing that was most unjust was what was called the rocket dockets. Now, you may remember 2014, 2015, there was what people called the surge. I don't much like that term. It's sort of dehumanizing, but nonetheless, that's what the media said. It was a surge of unaccompanied minors, unprecedented numbers of immigrant children showing up in our border. Now, how the administration responded to that was something called the rocket docket, which meant that these kids were being sped through court with very little time to prepare. So our organization, we completely changed how we did business. We started doing clinics where we were screening kids for relief, accepting their case right there, assigning it to a lawyer, and a lawyer was going right to court to represent these children. One experience I had really illustrates what the rocket dockets were like. This young man from Honduras went to court with his mother on Monday. He came into our office on Tuesday, where we were doing clinics, with a blank asylum application saying, I need to fill this out and bring it back to court on Thursday. He's going back to court in 3 days. This is an asylum application, very complicated, long form. We spend months preparing those for our clients. Well, we screened him for legal relief. He really did not have a strong asylum case, and most of these kids did not. The law really is inadequate to protect children from what essentially is gang war. The laws, particularly here in the Fifth Circuit, is not good. However, he was eligible for something called a special immigrant juvenile status visa. That required us to go to state court and get a court order from a state judge saying that this kid had been abused, abandoned, or neglected. It wasn't in his best interest to return to his country, and take that court order and then file it with the federal government to get him a visa. That all had to be done by Thursday, and we did it. Me and my staff drafted that petition. We filed it in state court. We couldn't get the court order, but we were in the process of getting, when I went to court on Thursday and said, Judge, this kid is eligible for a special immigrant juvenile status visa. We've already filed our state court petition. Here's a copy of it. And I said, we now have to send this paperwork to Honduras to get his father to sign or be served with it and get that document back to us. He said, you have 2 weeks to do that. And we did it. But, and that kid, we wound up getting him a special immigrant juvenile status visa. In my office is a picture of him picking up his green card about 2 years later. So it turned out fine for that kid, but it was only because we really sort of moved heaven and earth in order to make all that happen, because the court was like an assembly line running these kids through that court. And I remember, I'll never forget it, because Diane Cellist, who's a reporter for the Morning News, had interviewed this young man on Monday. And so she was in court, and I walked out, and I was so mad. I was really angry because of what was happening in court. She goes, can I ask you a few questions? I went, sure. No, let's wait an hour. And so I did. And so there was a press story about this young man, and it was fine. But this was an unjust thing, and it sticks in my mind still as one of the most unjust things I've ever seen. Well, that's a great segue to the next administration, the Trump administration. Well, we thought things like the rocket dockets were bad, and then President Trump said, hold my beer. And he was able to do things that were, and this is the difference, intentionally cruel in order to dissuade people from coming to our country. Didn't you think when you saw that lovely Yo-Yo Ma video, like, okay, this is what who we are, not who we are, but who we should be as a country. And yet, during the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, an avowed white nationalist, is drafting policies to be intentionally cruel, and he is aided and abetted by Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, and I will always say his entire name, who was drafting policy and laws. And the thing that gets me really worked up about this, if you hadn't noticed, I am a little worked up, is that these were smart people. They knew the law. They knew it in a very sophisticated way, and so they were drafting things way in the weeds of procedures that were intended to harm migrants and did harm migrants. I'll just give you one example. The matter of AB. You're like, what's the matter of AB? There had grown a body of law that protected women, survivors of domestic violence from Central America. The people, for instance, women in El Salvador experienced very high rates of femicide. And so courts said, look, if you're a woman and you cannot escape your abuser, you've gone to the police, you've gone to court, no one is helping you, you have no way out, and you escape to the United States, that's a particular social group. That's a group of people that our asylum laws will protect. So what does Jefferson Beauregard Sessions do? He, as the Attorney General, who's in charge of the immigration courts, refers the legal case to himself for review, reviews it, and overturns it. So this was an effort to destroy the case law protection for women survivors of domestic violence. Who does that? Well, fascists do that. And that's what was happening during the Trump administration. I remember speaking, I think I spoke to you here about the series of actions taken by the Trump administration intended to make it impossible for asylum seekers to seek refuge in our country. First, it was metering, just letting a few people across the border at a time. Then it was the Orwellian named migrant protection protocols, which we called Remain in Mexico, making persecuted people wait in squalid camps on the border in order to, while their asylum cases were pending, and then going to these large tent courts where about 1% of people were successful in their asylum cases. Then you had the transit bans, like the Muslim ban and other bans. And then there were the safe third country agreements that said if you had passed through Guatemala on your way here, you were barred from asylum. And then finally, Title 42, which has been in the news a lot, which was it was called a Stephen Miller special, which was this really very obscure public health law that allowed you to briefly shut the border in a public health emergency. And Stephen Miller decided, well, we're going to use that to really bar people from coming in and claiming asylum. And it resulted in tens of thousands of people being denied the opportunity to come here and seek refuge. Now, this was followed by the current administration, the Biden administration. Of course, everybody, including me, breathed this real sigh of relief. Maybe we'll finally, because we were promised these things were going to change. We're going to do away with some of these policies, and in fact, they have done away with some of them. They did away with the Muslim ban. They ended the migrant protection protocols. They ended Title 42, although belatedly after a lot of advocacy by organizations. Then the matter of AB, this case around domestic violence, the Attorney General Merrick Garland overturned that matter of AB. Then adjusted enforcement priorities back to the Obama era, which really prioritized that we were going to deport people with criminal issues and not just anyone that didn't have pristine immigration. So then we've had some other things that we've had, of course, a very, very robust and enthusiastic welcome to Ukrainians. We had a mixed reaction to welcoming Afghanis after the end of the American war in Afghanistan. The fact is many Afghanis have not been granted their special immigrant visas here to the United States. A lot of these translators, people that work with our military and aid agencies, have not been successful in getting their asylum cases granted here. But then, and perhaps most alarmingly, are these new asylum rules, which are the administration goes to great pains to tell us they're really different, but they're actually not very different. They're these bans to people. If you pass through another country and you didn't get asylum in Guatemala or Honduras, which, by the way, are countries that people are also fleeing. So if you didn't successfully get asylum there, you're barred from asylum here in the United States. Well, that was terrible. So what we did to address that was to create an app where people in their phones could apply for an appointment for an asylum interview. Well, that sounds fine if you're ordering groceries from Tom Thumb. But if you are a refugee in Matamoros and you are at risk every single day there, and by the way, the technology doesn't work very well, and you're trying to do this on your phone, it's been really a disastrous response. Now, kudos for them trying to do something creative and innovative and using technology, but it's been very, very poorly executed. So I always fear whenever I come and speak to you, you're like, why do we bring this downer guy in here, But the truth is, I feel a moral responsibility to speak the truth about what's going on. I love this country. I love what this country stands for, and it makes me extraordinarily angry that we are not living up to these things that we say about ourselves. And so that's why I do that. But I do want to talk about some highlights, some things that I've saw, positive things that have happened in the last 11 years. It was inspiring to watch my staff change our processes and procedures overnight to help those kids coming in here. In the last year or so, we've watched almost every week we have a kid picking up a green card. Who are those kids that came in here frightened and had been through really terrible things prior to coming here in the United States? That's very, very inspiring. It was very inspiring, actually one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen, to go to DFW Airport during the Muslim ban and see every activist lawyer I know there. Like everyone I know in this area was there at the airport. And it wasn't barely organized. People just heard about it and showed up. How can I help? And they were setting up laptops and watched Angela Hunt, our former city councilman, just put down a credit card and rent a room so all the lawyers could set up their laptops and draft writs of habeas corpus, try to get these people free. It was really, really a beautiful thing to see. Watching my colleagues at the other agency, Catholic Charities, Raices, Justice for Our Neighbors, provide free legal screenings at the workplace raids that happened here in Allen and Paris. And again, people just calling each other and said, hey, can you help? And we're going up there and screening these people who had been, that were in detention because they did these big workplace raids. Continuing to be inspired by our clients. I mean, again, I really could tell you story after story. I'll just give you an overview. We had 2 asylum seeker clients become registered nurses and serve during the COVID era. These were asylum seekers who have been nurses in their home countries. We helped them get their certification to be nurses here, and they're working in COVID units and hospitals here. These are the kind of people we have the privilege of representing. Watching our team adapt to COVID. Nobody was helping us design those things. We were researching, like a lot of other institutions. We're researching, how do we do this? How do we set up safe operations and help as many people as we can while looking out for the safety of our staff and their safety? So we drafted our own safety protocols. We had people make plexiglass shields that we could set up on tables, set up our tables in parking lots to distribute emergency aid, including $300,000 in rental assistance for people to help them pay their rent, toiletries, emergency food assistance, and of course, because courts were still operating to deport people. So we're still representing people. We were representing people stuck in Mexico under MPP using WhatsApp to talk to them and get asylum applications filled out and sent back to them in Mexico, so because they couldn't access lawyers because it was so dangerous to be there. And again, that was super inspiring. And it's inspiring to me now that I'm leaving an organization with a staff. It was a staff of 10 when I got there. Now it's a staff of 20. Very inspired, very dedicated people that are energized about the future. And that's a beautiful thing to see. A couple last things I want to mention. One is the work we did internally as an organization. I'm really proud of. So, like a lot of organizations, if they were conscientious at least in the George Floyd era, a lot of us looked at our own practices. Our organization looked at our practices, our hiring practices, our pay practices. We created internal pay equity committees, set minimum salaries that were tied to the cost of a one-bedroom apartment in Dallas. We made a concerted effort to broaden the scope of our hiring decisions so we could diversify our staff and make it so our staff was more reflective of the people that we were serving, because we were a pretty white organization before we made those efforts. And we're a much more diverse organization now than we were 2 years ago. One of the things that it was just hard, frankly, was for me to acknowledge my own part in that. I had made decisions because it's so difficult to raise money for what we do. We were paying people not an adequate wage. And I felt very badly about that. And a friend reminded me of the words of Maya Angelou, which is, do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better. And that was really reassuring. So why am I leaving all of this? Well, for a year, I've been talking to my board that they need to do succession planning. I was increasingly convinced that our organization should be led by a person of color, hopefully a woman of color, someone hopefully from an immigrant background, so that the representation was by someone who more reflected our clientele. Because as empathetic as I can be, and I'm really, really empathetic to our clients, but nonetheless, I do not have that lived experience. And having leadership that is reflective of the people we serve, I think, is really important. And I also believe quite firmly that it is really important for leaders to know when it is time to move aside and make room for new leadership. And I think that is a tragic mistake. I think boomers are about the worst of it. We don't like stepping aside, but it's sometimes that comes from a good place of wanting to serve, but nonetheless, you are standing there and not providing an opportunity for someone else, someone from the communities we serve, to be a leader. And so I've told my board that, and we're in the process of hiring an executive director that's going to reflect that. And I said to somebody, I feel like in some ways that's the most, because I love this organization. I love the work. And I feel like in a lot of ways it's the most selfless thing I've done is to leave because of the reasons I just said. And we don't have great examples of people doing that, of leaving. One of my good friends, Rosalind Dawson, was the CEO at the Texas Women's Foundation. And she told me, I left after 10 years. I was there 10 years, and then you've done what you can do. You need to step aside and make room for another person. And that was really inspiring to me. Probably the best example of that, however, is Nelson Mandela. I found this quote, this article about him in NPR. They said, one of the reporters from South Africa said, Nelson Mandela deserved a second Nobel Prize for Peace for stepping down because of the example it set in Africa, because so many people in Africa, even in government, are frustrated their leaders never step down. Once they get in, they stay. And he said, I think he wanted to see a younger generation of people steeped in modern economies running the place. He wanted to step back and be a physical example of stepping back and letting it happen. And so I wrote my staff to tell them that I was leaving and that I was doing, and the reasons for that. And then I attached a little sign, just a note, handwritten note that is hanging above my desk And one of our former legal assistants gave it to me years ago on Boss's Day. And I find it very inspiring and inspires my decision to change. And it's from Laozi. It says, to lead people, walk beside them. As for the best leaders, the people do not notice their existence. The next best, the people honor and praise. The next, the people fear. And the next, the people hate. When the best leader's work is done, the people say, we did it ourselves. And that is what I hope my legacy at HRI is. Thank you so much for the chance to talk to you today. I'll end on this note. I do a lot of speaking. I speak to a lot of churches. And often I get asked the question, what can we do to help? And I'll say, well, you could organize a toiletry drive, but my experience is bars are a lot more reliable than churches. And that is true, except for you. You do exactly what, and have been doing it since the first time I spoke here. And I just want to give credit to you. I speak at much better resourced organizations than you are that are much less generous. And I just wanted to thank you for the bottom of my heart. And I will be back. I'm going to the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center. We're doing legal services for people getting evicted. I'm going to learn all about that, and I'll be back talking to you about that. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking to us, Bill, but also just thank you for your service to this community and the nation. We appreciate you.